I've always enjoyed the quiet of the woods. It's a place where everything slows down, where the air feels cleaner, the trees seem taller, and you can actually hear your thoughts without the rush of city noise. That's why I decided to spend the weekend in a remote cabin I found online. It was located in a forest, a good 3 hours away from the nearest town, perfect for a peaceful escape. The cabin was small, but it had everything I needed: a rustic charm, a wood-burning stove, an old rocking chair by the window, and a sense of isolation that felt like a blessing. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky a brilliant orange, the trees casting long, slanting shadows across the dirt path. The place looked exactly as it had in the pictures. Simple, quiet, and inviting, but something about it felt a little off. The air was thicker here, and the silence, while soothing, felt strange. The owner, an older woman named Sarah, had left a note on the kitchen table with the usual instructions. Turn off the lights when you leave, make sure the doors are locked, no loud noises after dark. I chuckled at the last part. I hadn't planned on making noise. I was here to get away from everything, not to disturb the peace. But there was something about the cabin's solitude that nagged at me. I felt like I was being watched, though I could see no one around. I set down my bags and took a walk around the property. The trees surrounded the cabin like a wall, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. It was peaceful, too peaceful. After unpacking, I built a fire in the stove and settled into the rocking chair with a book. The place was cozy, warm from the fire, and the air smelled of wood and pine. As the hours passed, I felt myself relaxing, the stress of my usual life melting away. But then, just after dark, I heard it, a faint thud. I froze, looking up. Came from outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the noise was too consistent, too rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the kind of sound animals made. It sounded like footsteps. My heart began to race as I stood up and moved toward the window, my eyes straining to make out anything in the darkness. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to push the thought from my mind. It was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and silence can do strange things to the mind. Still, the sound didn't stop. Thud, thud, thud. It grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the door. The wood creaked under my weight, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it, but I had this overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I cracked open the door, shining the flashlight into the dark. Nothing. The porch was empty. The only movement, the faint swaying of the trees. But the feeling didn't leave. In fact, it grew stronger, as if the air had thickened, pressing in around me. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But then, I heard it again. The thud. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart racing. My flashlight's beam swept over the porch, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, oppressive forest. My hand shook as I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just the wind, the trees rubbing against the cabin. But it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional, like something was out there. I sat down on the couch, trying to distract myself with my book, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept returning to the sound. I wasn't alone. I could feel it in my gut. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start. My eyes flicked to the clock. It was past midnight. The house was dead silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I sat up, scanning the room. It was then I noticed the front door. It was slightly ajar. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way I'd left the door open. I was sure of it. Slowly, I walked over to it, feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. The door creaked as I pushed it open all the way. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp. I stepped outside, the flashlight in my hand shaking. The world felt still, too still. The trees were quiet, the wind dead. I turned in a circle, but I saw nothing, not a trace of anyone. The only thing I could hear now was the rapid beating of my heart. I searched the area around the cabin, shining the light into every corner, but there was no sign of anything or anyone. No footprints, no disturbed ground, no signs of life at all. Still, the sense of dread hung in the air, thick and heavy. I wasn't imagining it. Something had been out there, and now it was gone. The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I kept listening, waiting for that sound to return, for the footsteps to start again. But they never did. The cabin remained silent, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. The next morning, I woke to the soft chirping of birds, the sunlight filtering through the trees. Everything looked normal again, peaceful. But that nagging feeling stayed with me. I decided to pack up and leave. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I started the truck and drove down the dirt road, glancing back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw someone, standing in the window, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station and filled up, the sound of the pump strangely comforting. The attendant, an older man with a weathered face, gave me a long look as I paid. "You staying out there alone?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. He shook his head slowly. "Not many people do that. Not many come back either." I frowned, unsure how to respond. "You'll be fine," he added with a forced smile. "But if you're smart, you'll stay away from that cabin." I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. I knew I wouldn't be going back. Some places are meant to be left alone. Some things are better left undisturbed. The whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, waiting for me to leave. That maybe, just maybe, I was the one who had disturbed something. But at least I was leaving, and that was enough. The cabin was supposed to be the escape, the retreat I needed, away from the noise of the city, from the clutter of everyday life. I'd heard about it from a friend who swore it was the perfect spot. Secluded, quiet, and peaceful, nestled in the woods, miles from the nearest town. I rented it online, not even bothering to check for reviews, that I would later regret. I arrived late in the evening, the sky already a dark shade of purple as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that made your breath visible, and the forest around me seemed to stretch endlessly, an intimidating maze of towering trees. The cabin was small, wooden, and a little worn, but the charm of it was undeniable. It sat by the edge of a small, murky pond. The water reflected the fading light, casting eerie shadows that danced on the trees. I had to admit it was peaceful, too peaceful. Inside, the cabin was simple, nothing fancy but functional. A small living room with an old stone fireplace, a kitchenette, and one bedroom. I'd brought only the essentials. Some food, a few books, and a bottle of whiskey for the nights when the silence might feel too loud. After unpacking, I set up a fire, the crackling wood and the warm glow providing a comforting contrast to the chill outside. The first night was peaceful. There were no sounds of the usual wildlife, no coyotes howling or rustling in the bushes, but I figured that was just the isolation, and I didn't think much of it. I spent the evening with my book and a glass of whiskey, watching the flames flicker and listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling. everything felt fine. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. It was unsettling, as if the woods themselves were trying to communicate something. The small pond outside seemed to ripple, despite the lack of any breeze near it. I chalked it up to my imagination. I had spent plenty of time in isolated places before, and the quiet could sometimes feel unnerving. But there was something about this place that felt different. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the silence pressed against you, like something was waiting for you to break it. I sat by the fire again, trying to read, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. The floor creaked above me, a light thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving upstairs. My pulse quickened, and my grip tightened around the glass in my hand. I stood up slowly, cautiously, and moved toward the stairs. Every step I took felt heavier, the air thicker, like the weight of the house was pushing against me. The stairs led up to a small loft space. I could barely make out the shadow of the railing from below. I called out, though I wasn't sure why. No one was supposed to be here. But still, I called out, "Hello!" My voice echoed back at me, louder than I expected. I waited, holding my breath. Silence. Then, a faint scraping sound. It was soft but distinct, coming from the far corner of the loft. My heart pounded as I crept up the stairs, every movement deliberate. The air upstairs was colder, like it hadn't been touched in years. I reached the top and paused, scanning the room. There was nothing there. No one. Only an old rocking chair, its back turned to me. Creaked again and I froze. My eyes locked on it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I walked over slowly, my steps unnervingly loud. I reached out and turned the chair around. Empty, but I noticed something strange. Dust and dirt were scattered across the floor in a pattern, as though something had dragged across it. I knelt down to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. A single footprint in the dust. I stumbled back, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have been up here. I had checked the place thoroughly when I arrived, and there was no sign of anyone else. Yet the footprint remained, clear and undeniable. My thoughts spiraled. Was I losing it? Was I just imagining things? But then the wind howled again, louder this time, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something tapping on the window. I rushed to the window, throwing the curtains aside, but all I saw was the vast emptiness of the forest, the trees swaying violently in the wind. No one was out there. I spent the next few hours pacing the cabin, trying to convince myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I tried to relax by the fire, but my mind kept racing. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep on the couch. The next morning, I woke to a strange sight. The footprints upstairs were still there, but now there were more of them. They had spread across the room, some leading toward the window, others toward the closet. I felt a cold chill settle in the pit of my stomach. It was clear now someone had been here, and they weren't gone. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were undeniable. The window had been left slightly ajar, the breeze now carrying a faint scent of damp earth, and the woods outside looked darker, as though something had shifted overnight. I tried to call for help, but the cabin had no cell service, and the nearest town was a 2-hour drive away. I was alone, and I wasn't sure how long that would remain true. I spent the day trying to gather my thoughts, but every shadow seemed to move. The eerie silence was back, pressing against me, making it impossible to concentrate. I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, rushed down the stairs, and went to the door. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct, coming from outside. The unmistakable crunch of leaves beneath heavy footsteps. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I opened the door, and there, Standing at the edge of the porch was a figure, tall, hunched slightly, its face obscured by a hood. I couldn't make out any features. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away slowly, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't advance, it just stood there, watching. I felt my heart in my throat, and every instinct screamed to escape, but my feet were rooted to the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing into the thick trees. I ran. I didn't stop. I grabbed my bag and bolted for my car, not caring about anything else. I didn't even think about locking the door behind me. I just needed to leave. As I sped down the gravel road, the trees parted slightly, and I glanced back at the cabin. It stood there, still and silent, as though nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had been there, whatever had watched me, wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and it was still out there, waiting. But I never returned to that cabin. Couldn't. The thought of going back, even just to check if it was all in my head, made my skin crawl. I drove straight through to the nearest town, didn't stop for anything, and when I reached a gas station, I finally let myself breathe. But I knew, deep down, that the woods had claimed something, and I had barely escaped. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I stepped out of my car and onto the narrow dirt road leading up to the cabin. It was late afternoon, the kind of warm, fading sunlight that makes everything look soft and golden. I hadn't seen much of the world beyond my small apartment in a while, and the thought of escaping the grind for a weekend alone in the woods felt like a welcome break. The cabin was secluded, tucked away on the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. I had rented it on a whim, finding it online after a quick search. It was rustic, but it had the charm I was looking for. A place to unplug, unwind, and get some peace of mind. I didn't expect much. A couple of rooms, a fireplace, maybe a few old, creaky floorboards. Just the way I liked it. The first few moments, stepping into the place, were exactly as I imagined. The cabin smelled of old wood, and the windows let in just enough light to make everything feel cozy. It was small but functional. A couch, a simple kitchen, a wood-burning stove in the corner. The kind of place you could get lost in without feeling isolated. I unpacked quickly, throwing my things into the small bedroom and then setting out to explore the area. The porch overlooked a small clearing, and beyond that, the woods stretched endlessly, like they were calling me to come deeper. I wandered into the trees, my boots crunching the dry leaves beneath me. It was peaceful, too peaceful, maybe, the kind of stillness that made the smallest sounds echo. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment I should have turned back. As I walked through the forest, I noticed something strange. A thin trail of smoke curled up from behind a ridge in the distance. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like it was coming from a campfire. Curious, I decided to follow it. The last thing I expected was to run into anyone. This place was remote, too remote for casual hikers or campers. I figured it could just be some people passing through, but the closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. I reached the ridge and peered over it, but there was nothing.
No campfire.
No people. Just an empty patch of ground with a few burnt logs. But the smoke was still there, lingering, faint but undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned back toward the cabin, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. Felt like I was being watched. It wasn't anything I could see, but it was the kind of feeling that creeps up on you. Something in the back of your mind telling you that you're not alone. That evening, I tried to relax. I sat in front of the fire, reading a book, the crackling of the flames the only sound. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway. It was the kind of wind that made the night feel colder, even if the temperature was still mild. I made myself a quick dinner, nothing fancy, and ate at the small table by the window. The night came quickly, and soon the only light in the cabin was from the fire. I poured myself a glass of wine, leaning back in my chair, trying to push the feeling of discomfort away. I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more. But then I heard it, a soft noise, a tapping. It came from outside the cabin, faint at first, like someone was knocking on the wooden walls. I stiffened, setting the glass of wine down. My mind raced. Could be the wind, could be an animal. But the noise was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, moving toward the door. The tapping stopped as soon as I opened it, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I shone the light around the porch, but there was nothing. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty, just the dark, undisturbed grass swaying in the wind. I stepped outside, shining the light in every direction, but there was no sign of anyone. The tapping had stopped completely. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just imagining it. Someone or something was out there. The woods seemed too quiet now, the wind stilling almost unnaturally. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a tree branch tapping against the wall. I had no reason to think otherwise, but the unease I felt kept growing. I closed the door behind me and locked it. The last thing I wanted to do was go out into the woods in the dark, so I went to bed, hoping that sleep would bring me some peace. But it didn't. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something scratching at the window. My heart stopped. The scratching was slow, deliberate, like it was trying to get my attention. I lay in bed, frozen, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent cabin. My breath felt heavy in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. But I wasn't. This was real. The scratching was too distinct. I crept out of bed and grabbed the flashlight again, my mind racing. I moved toward the window, shining the light outside. There was nothing there. No animal, no person, just the dark, empty yard. But then, as I was about to pull the curtain shut, I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape that seemed to be watching the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt a wave of panic. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still, like it was waiting for something. I stared at it for what felt like forever. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep. Instead, I sat by the fire, my mind racing with all the possibilities. Maybe it was someone who lived in the area, someone who had noticed my arrival and was curious. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a simple case of curiosity. Whoever or whatever had been watching me was not normal. It wasn't just a random person, and it wasn't an animal. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally far. By morning, I was exhausted, and the cabin felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't want to leave, but I didn't feel safe anymore. The idea of staying another night in that cabin, knowing someone was watching me, was too much. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to check the cabin one last time, and left as soon as I could. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cabin was just a small dot in the distance, hidden by the trees. The forest around it was still and silent, but somehow it felt like it was hiding something. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe it wasn't. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never be going back. I don't even know why I agreed to this. Maybe it was the stress of work. Maybe it was just that nagging urge to get away from the city. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle being alone. Either way, I found myself driving up a winding dirt road in the middle of nowhere, heading to a cabin I had rented for the weekend. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the trees, and the quiet. No emails, no people, just solitude. That was the plan, at least. The cabin was small, nothing fancy. Just a wooden structure with a steep roof, a wraparound porch, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The listing had said it was rustic and cozy, which I quickly realized was code for old and kind of falling apart. But it didn't matter. I wasn't here for luxury. I was here to clear my head. I parked my car on the gravel patch beside the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled like pine, fresh and crisp, a stark contrast to the exhaust-filled city air I was used to. The trees stretched high, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze, casting long, moving shadows over the ground. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping lower, painting the sky in deep orange hues. I grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk and walked up the creaky steps to the porch. The key was supposed to be under the doormat. I lifted it and, sure enough, there it was, rusty, old, slightly bent, but it fit the lock. The door groaned when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and wood. The furniture was simple. An old couch with frayed fabric, a coffee table scarred with scratches, and a fireplace filled with ashes from what looked like a fire someone had lit months ago. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim yellowish glow over the room. There was a tiny kitchen with a mini fridge, a 2-burner stove, and a sink with a single rust-stained faucet. A small hallway led to the bedroom, which had nothing but a queen-sized bed covered in an old quilt and a dresser missing a drawer. The bathroom was even smaller, just a shower, a toilet, and a sink with a mirror that was so cloudy I could barely see my reflection. It wasn't much, but it would do. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in. I had brought enough food to last the weekend. Canned soup, granola bars, a loaf of bread, some peanut butter. I figured I wouldn't need much. The plan was simple: relax, read, maybe take a few hikes during the day. As I stood on the porch later that evening, watching the last bit of sunlight fade behind the treetops, I noticed something. A noise. Faint, distant. It wasn't the wind, wasn't an animal. It was a creaking sound, like wood bending, shifting under pressure. First, I ignored it. Old cabins make noise, I told myself. It's just the wood settling. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate creak, like footsteps on the porch. I turned sharply, but there was nothing. Just trees, the empty driveway, and my car sitting where I had left it. Shaking my head, I went inside and locked the door. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had spent too many years surrounded by the constant noise of the city. Maybe I wasn't used to silence. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The mattress was stiff, the room was cold, and the walls felt too thin. Every little sound outside, every rustling leaf, every snapping branch, made my pulse quicken. Then I heard it again. The porch creaked. I held my breath, listening. My fingers curled around the blanket. Another creak, closer this time. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. My mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe a deer had wandered up. Maybe it was just the wind pushing against the wood. Then the doorknob rattled. I froze. Someone was outside. For a long, suffocating moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there listening, waiting. The rattling stopped, and silence stretched on. I told myself I imagined it, that it was in my head, that it was nothing. Then, from the other side of the wall, I heard a low, deliberate exhale. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom window. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and flicked it on, aiming it at the window. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing but empty glass and the reflection of my own pale face. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The noises didn't come back. No footsteps, no breathing. By the time the sky turned gray with the first light of dawn, I had convinced myself that I had just imagined it. Maybe I was more stressed than I realized. Maybe I was just on edge because I was alone. Either way, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the paranoia. The woods were quiet, peaceful. I followed a narrow trail up a hill and sat on a fallen log, eating a granola bar and watching the treetops sway in the wind. It almost made me forget about last night. Almost. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low again. The unease returned the moment I stepped onto the porch. The front door was closed, just as I had left it, but something felt off. I turned the knob slowly and pushed it open. The air inside was still heavy. I stepped in and looked around. Everything was where I had left it. The couch, the table, the fireplace. Then I saw it. The closet door in the bedroom. It was open. I knew for a fact I had closed it. My stomach twisted into a knot. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the dark opening. Then, from inside the closet, I heard the faintest sound. Breathing. I ran. I didn't think, didn't grab anything, just turned and bolted out the door, sprinting toward my car. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached the driver's side. I could still hear it, the sound of something moving inside the cabin. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights flashed across the porch as I threw the car into reverse. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Something low to the ground, moving quickly, disappearing into the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, all the way down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. I don't know who was in that cabin. I don't know how long they had been there watching me, but I do know one thing. I was never alone. I didn't plan on spending the night at the cabin. It was supposed to be a quick trip. Drive up, check on the property, make sure no animals had broken in, and head back before dark. But things never go as planned. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had bought it years ago as a getaway spot, though he hardly used it. After he passed, it sat untouched. No one in the family wanted it, but I saw potential. A quiet place in the woods, far from people, far from stress. I figured I'd clean it up, make it my own. The drive up was uneventful. A long stretch of road winding through thick forest, followed by a dirt path barely visible under years of overgrowth. The trees pressed in on both sides, making the air feel thick, heavy. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood there, exactly as I remembered, small, dark, weathered by time. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not rot, not mold, but something stale, like old wood and dust mixed with something faintly sour. The second thing was the silence. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves. Just stillness. I shook it off, chalked it up to nerves, and pushed open the stiff wooden door. Inside, the air was thick, undisturbed. Dust coated every surface. A few dead flies lay belly up on the window sills. The furniture was exactly as my uncle had left it. A worn-out couch, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, a fireplace filled with old ash. The kitchen area was a mess of rusted pots and abandoned dishes. I checked the bedroom next. The bed was covered in a thick layer of dust, the sheets yellowed with time. The closet door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness. Something about it made my stomach twist, but I ignored it and got to work. I started with the windows, prying them open to let in fresh air. The breeze was cool, but it did nothing to shake the heaviness in the cabin. I swept the floor, cleared out cobwebs, tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. The sensation didn't come from outside. It came from inside the cabin, from the walls, from the dark corners where the light didn't quite reach. Then I found the trapdoor. It was under the rug in the bedroom, an old wooden panel with a rusted handle. I almost didn't see it, but the edge of the rug had curled up just enough to reveal the corner. My uncle had never mentioned a basement. I hesitated. Something deep in my gut told me not to open it. But curiosity is a powerful thing. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The wood groaned, resisting, but finally, the door swung open, revealing a steep wooden staircase leading down into darkness. The air that rushed up smelled damp, earthy, wrong. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the blackness as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. The basement wasn't large. The walls were made of stone, lined with shelves stacked with old canned goods, tools, and other forgotten things. But in the farthest corner, there was something else. A small wooden chair, and on it, a bundle of cloth, tied up tight. I didn't want to touch it, but my hand moved on its own, undoing the knot. Inside was a pile of bones, small ones, animal bones, I told myself, but something about them wasn't right. They were too clean, too carefully arranged. And beneath them, a notebook. The pages were filled with my uncle's handwriting, neat but frantic. He wrote about noises at night, about things moving when he wasn't looking. He wrote about waking up with scratches on his arms, about feeling something breathing in the dark. Then, the last entry, "It doesn't want me to leave." I felt the air shift around me, the temperature dropping. My breath came out in short gasps. I needed to get out. Now, I stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut. The cabin felt different now, smaller, like the walls were pressing in. The air buzzed with something unseen. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, but the door wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle. Nothing. The lock wasn't stuck. It was as if something was holding it shut from the outside. Then I heard it, a creak. Not from me, not from the wind. From inside the cabin. The bedroom door, which I had left open, was now closed. My breathing turned ragged. I tried the windows, but they wouldn't budge. The walls felt closer, suffocating. The cabin, this place, didn't want me to leave. I forced myself to think. I needed to get out, needed to break a window, something. But then the trapdoor creaked. I didn't look, couldn't. I just ran. I threw my full weight against the door, again and again until something gave. I stumbled outside, nearly tripping down the porch steps. The air was colder now, the sky darker. The forest that had felt still before now felt alive, shifting, watching. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, heart hammering, hands shaking. I didn't look back. I don't know what my uncle found in that basement. I don't know why the cabin felt the way it did. But I do know one thing. I will never go back. I never should have gone back to that cabin. I'd booked it months in advance, planning for a quiet getaway from the city. I found it on a website that advertised remote cabins for people looking to escape the noise of their lives. It was deep in the woods of northern Montana, a long way from any town, any neighbor, any help. That was the point. I wanted solitude. No emails, no texts, no ringing phones. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the river running somewhere in the distance. The drive took longer than expected. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt, then to something that barely looked like a road at all. My truck was the only vehicle for miles. The further I went, the denser the trees got. The only signs of life were the occasional deer or hawk overhead. I should have turned back when I lost cell service, but I told myself I'd been expecting that. I was getting what I wanted. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had almost set. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story wooden structure with a front porch, a tin roof, and a chimney that hadn't been used in years. There was a fire pit out front, a stack of logs nearby, and a single rocking chair that creaked in the wind. The place looked old but solid. I got out of the truck, stretched, and listened. The silence was thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath.
No birds, no insects.
Just the wind pushing through the trees. That was the first thing that felt wrong, but I ignored it. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and wood. The air was stale. There was one main room with a kitchen on one side, a couch, and a small dining table. A single door led to a bedroom with a queen-sized bed, a dresser, and an old oil lamp on the nightstand. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom that looked barely functional. I set my bag down, started unpacking. I had enough food for the week, a few books, a flashlight, my knife. I went to check the generator in the back. It started with a cough and a sputter, the old machine struggling to wake up, but after a minute, it settled into a steady hum. The cabin lights flickered, then held. Good enough. That night, I sat on the porch drinking a beer, listening. The quiet had weight. I could hear the creak of the trees swaying, the occasional rustling of leaves. I told myself it was peaceful, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. When I finally went to bed, I locked the door behind me, slid the bolt into place. The mattress was stiff, the sheets cold. I fell asleep facing the door. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. I held my breath, listening. Something had moved outside. Footsteps? No, more like a dragging sound. Something heavy being pulled across the dirt. I sat up, heart pounding. The clock on the nightstand said 2:17 a.m. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on. The light made the shadows leap across the walls. I listened. Silence. I told myself it was nothing. An animal. The wind. But I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside. The ground was soft from the night's rain. Near the porch, in the dirt, there were tracks. Not boot prints. Not animal prints. Just long, dragging lines like something had been pulled through the mud. I checked the woods, scanning the trees, searching for anything that felt out of place. There was nothing, just the endless stretch of forest, dark and still. That day, I kept myself busy, chopped some firewood, walked to the river, cooked a simple meal. I tried to ignore the unease in my stomach, but as the sun set, the fear crept back in. That night, I locked the door again. I double-checked the windows. I kept my flashlight next to me, my knife within reach. I woke up to the sound of something breathing. It was close, too close, right outside the bedroom window. Slow, steady, a deep inhale, a long exhale. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A moose? But no, the breathing was too controlled, too human. I clenched my flashlight, my hand shaking. I didn't want to turn it on. If I turned it on, I'd have to look. The breathing continued. Then, a slow, deliberate tap on the glass. I snapped on the flashlight, aimed it at the window. Nothing. The sound was gone. The night was empty. I barely slept. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my bag, threw it in the truck, turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I got out, popped the hood. The battery cables were gone. Not chewed, not corroded, gone. Something had taken them. I stood there, gripping the edge of the truck, breathing hard. The forest stretched out in every direction. I had no cell service, no way to call for help. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. I went back inside, locked the door. I needed a plan. I had food, water. I could wait. Someone would come eventually. The day passed in a blur of pacing, checking the windows, listening. As night fell, I felt it again, that pressure, that presence just beyond the trees. Watching. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, facing the door, knife in my lap. The sound came again. The breathing, the dragging, then footsteps, slow, purposeful, moving around the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft knock on the door. Not frantic, not urgent, just a single patient tap. I gripped my knife tighter. My pulse hammered in my ears. The knock came again. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. At some point, exhaustion took me. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the sun was rising. I checked outside. The tracks were there, circling the cabin. Close, too close. And in the dirt, just outside the door, something had been left for me. My truck's battery cables, neatly coiled, placed there like a gift. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed them, reattached them, started the truck. It roared to life. I threw my bag inside, slammed the door, and hit the gas. As I tore down that dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a second, just a second, I saw something standing at the tree line. Tall, still, watching. Then the trees swallowed it whole. I never looked back again. I never thought I'd end up living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, but life has a way of pushing people into places they never expected. After losing my job and burning through my savings faster than I could have imagined, I needed somewhere cheap and isolated to stay while I figured things out. A friend of a friend mentioned an old hunting cabin in the Adirondacks. It wasn't much, one room, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom that barely functioned, but it was cheap, and at that point, cheap was all that mattered. The drive up there took nearly a full day. The deeper I went into the mountains, the more I realized how truly alone I would be. No streetlights, no cell service, just dense trees on either side of the road. When I finally arrived, the place looked even worse than I had imagined. The wood was aged and weathered, the windows streaked with grime. It had been abandoned for a while, but it was shelter, and I wasn't in a position to be picky. The first week was uneventful. The silence was unnerving at first, but I told myself it was peaceful. I spent my days chopping wood, fixing up the cabin, and hiking the trails nearby. At night, I'd light a fire in the wood stove, read by candlelight, and go to sleep early. The quiet made me restless, but I figured I'd get used to it. Then, things started to feel off. It was little things at first. My tools weren't where I left them. The old wooden door would be slightly open in the morning, even though I was sure I had locked it the night before. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or maybe the wind. But then, I started hearing noises outside. Heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate movements like someone or something was circling the cabin. One night, I woke up to a distinct sound just outside my window. Breathing, slow, deep, and steady. My heart pounded so loud I swore it would give me away. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing myself, straining my ears. Whatever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity before I heard it move away. The next morning, I found tracks around the cabin. Large, human-like footprints, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. They led from the edge of the woods, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started keeping my axe by the door and barricading it at night. Sleep became harder. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the walls put me on edge. Then one night I heard something different. A low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of nails dragging across the cabin wall. I sat up in bed, gripping the handle of my axe so hard my knuckles ached. The scratching moved from one wall to another, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there was testing the structure. Then silence. That was worse. For the next few nights, I barely slept. The noises continued. The footsteps, the scratching. Once, I heard what sounded like a whispered breath right against the window. I started thinking about leaving, but I didn't have anywhere to go. My money was gone, and I couldn't exactly show up at a motel and explain why I was running from something. Then, it got inside that I woke up to the sound of something knocking over the kitchen chair. My blood ran cold. The cabin was pitch black, but I could hear it moving. Something heavy shifting across the wooden floor. I stayed frozen, gripping my axe, listening to my own heartbeat hammer in my chest. Then it breathed, a deep, slow inhale like it was taking in my scent. It was right there, just a few feet away. Couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The air was heavy, suffocating. I had two choices: sit there and hope it left or make a move. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the axe, and lunged. The second I moved, there was a sudden explosion of sound. Something large scrambling across the floor, knocking over furniture. I swung wildly, connecting with nothing but empty air. Then I heard it, an inhuman screech that sent ice through my veins. A rush of movement toward the door, then the slam of it being forced open, and then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, axe in hand, waiting for whatever it was to come back. But it didn't. When the sun finally rose, I found the door hanging off its hinges, deep gouges in the wood. The kitchen table had been flipped, and there were deep scratches along the walls. But the worst part, the footprints, leading from my bed to the door. It had been standing right next to me, watching me. I left that day, packed up whatever I could fit in my truck and drove away, never looking back. I didn't care where I ended up. Anywhere was better than that place. I never told anyone what happened, not because I think they wouldn't believe me, but because I don't even want to say it out loud. Even now, in the safety of a new town, in a house full of people, I still wake up some nights thinking I hear it breathing. Still smell the damp, earthy stench it left behind. I don't go into the woods anymore, and I never, ever sleep with the windows open. It started as a quiet getaway. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forests of Montana, miles from the nearest town. I wanted peace, a break from the noise of the city, and most of all, time away from people. I wasn't the type to enjoy crowded places, and the idea of being out in the wilderness with nothing but trees and the wind was appealing. I had planned a full week of isolation. No phone service, no internet, just me, my thoughts, and the sound of the wild. The drive up was uneventful. The gravel road twisted through dense trees, and the further I went, the rougher the terrain became. I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour by the time I reached the cabin. It was an old wooden structure, built decades ago, but well kept. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a single window on the side gave me a limited view inside. The key had been left under a loose rock, just as the owner had instructed. I let myself in. Inside, it was simple: a small kitchenette with a rusty sink, a tiny bathroom with a barely functioning toilet, and a bedroom with a single bed covered in a thick wool blanket. It smelled of wood and dust, a bit stale but not unpleasant. There was an old fireplace, and next to it, a small stack of firewood. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, made a quick meal, and sat outside on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. The silence was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I slept well that night, the cool air wrapping around me like a cocoon. The second day was when things started to feel off. I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee on the old gas stove, and stepped outside. Something was different. The woods, which had been so full of natural noise the day before, were eerily quiet.
No birds, no insects.
Just a heavy stillness that pressed against my ears. I brushed it off and spent the day exploring. There were no trails, but I had a map and a compass, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I hiked for hours, letting my mind clear as I walked through the dense forest. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt like I was being watched. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching like fingers, and the silence was unnatural. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, but there was nothing. No wind, no animals, just the sound of my own breathing. I turned back earlier than planned. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. I felt relief stepping inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know why I felt so nervous, but something about the woods had unsettled me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound made my heart race. A branch snapping outside, the wind pushing against the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard something, or someone, walking outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath, listening, but after a while, the noise stopped. On the third day, I woke up to find something strange. The stack of firewood outside had been knocked over. It wasn't windy, and there were no animals around that could have done it. It looked like someone had kicked it over. I scanned the area, but I didn't see any footprints or signs of anyone being there. Still, the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. I decided to stay near the cabin that day. I didn't feel like wandering too far, not after the way I felt in the woods the day before. I kept myself busy, chopping more firewood, cleaning up inside. I made sure everything was locked before I went to bed. That night was the worst. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It was faint at first, like a distant crunching. Then it grew louder. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving around the cabin. I held my breath, my body frozen. My mind raced with possibilities, an animal, maybe a bear. But no, bears didn't move like that. This was something or someone walking. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. The doorknob rattled. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. I reached for the old hunting knife I had packed, gripping it tightly as I stared at the door. The rattling stopped, but I heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving along the porch. They stopped by the window. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, then hours. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up, the sun was streaming through the window. Everything looked normal. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside. But I knew what I had heard. I made my decision that morning. I packed up my things, threw everything in my car, and left. I didn't care if I had paid for a full week. I wasn't staying another night. As I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire time I was there. I never found out who or what had been outside my cabin that night. Maybe it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe it was someone who had been watching me since I arrived, waiting for the right moment. I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never go back. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I had been looking forward to getting away from the city, away from the constant hum of traffic, ringing phones, and people who never seemed to stop moving. The idea of solitude had become something I craved more and more as life piled on stress after stress. So when I found an old cabin for rent deep in the Washington woods, I jumped at the opportunity. It was remote, secluded enough that the nearest town was nearly an hour's drive away. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, nature, and the open space to clear my head. The drive there took longer than I had expected. The main road leading into the woods turned into a narrow dirt path that twisted and climbed through thick trees. Sunlight barely made it through the canopy, making the entire area feel darker than it should have. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, old and weathered, with a porch that looked like it might give way under too much weight. The trees crowded so closely around it that even at midday, it felt like dusk. The air smelled damp, the scent of earth and rotting leaves thick after the previous night's rain. I stepped out of my car and stretched, taking in the eerie silence. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. The only sound was the creaking of the cabin's wooden porch as I made my way to the door. Inside, the cabin was exactly as the listing described. Simple, rustic, and well-worn. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked more uncomfortable than anything I had ever slept on. It smelled like old wood and dust. I dropped my bag on the couch and went to check the back of the cabin, where a small shed stood just past the treeline. It was locked. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the fireplace, had a simple dinner, and spent some time reading by lantern light. The lack of cell service was both a relief and a discomfort. I had no distractions, but also no way to call for help if something went wrong. I forced myself to push that thought away. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was safe. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just the sound of something moving, a rustling, like dry leaves shifting underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding, listening in the dark. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, the idea of something or someone outside unsettled me. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, until the sound stopped. Then I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints near the edge of the trees. Human footprints. They were half washed away by the rain, but they were there, barefoot. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the highway. The thought of someone walking around in the dark, barefoot, near my cabin, it didn't sit right. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a camper, maybe a hunter. Maybe I was overreacting. But that night, I heard the noises again. This time, closer. Something moved just outside the cabin, slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it at the window, but I couldn't see anything. My throat felt tight. The steps didn't go away. They moved to the side of the cabin, then to the back. I gripped the flashlight tighter, willing myself not to panic. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the perimeter again. More footprints. This time, they were fresh, close to the cabin. Too close. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I considered leaving, but part of me refused to let fear ruin my trip. Maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe my mind was making it worse than it was. That evening, I forced myself to stay calm. I made dinner, read my book, and tried to ignore the way the trees felt like they were pressing in. The wind picked up, making the old wooden beams groan. I locked the door, checked the windows, and kept the flashlight within reach. I told myself I'd be fine. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The steps. Slow, heavy. Something dragging across the porch. My hands tightened around the flashlight. My mouth was dry. I wanted to move, to do something, but I was frozen. The noise stopped just outside the front door. I held my breath, listening. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. The creak of the door handle turning. I bolted from the couch, grabbing the closest thing I could, a fire poker. I stood in the middle of the room, every muscle in my body tense. The handle rattled again, then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, fire poker in hand, watching the door until the first light of morning bled through the trees. When I finally got the courage to step outside, my stomach dropped. The footprints were back. This time, they circled the cabin. Again and again. I didn't pack my things. I didn't take my time. I grabbed my keys, got into my car, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, didn't breathe until I saw other cars on the road. It wasn't until I was miles away that I pulled over, hands shaking against the wheel. When I checked the rental listing later, the cabin was gone. No record of it. No listing, no owner. Like it had never been there at all. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I won't be going back to the woods anytime soon. The summer I turned 16 was the strangest, most terrifying summer of my life. That's a fact I won't ever forget. Not just because it was the year my whole world felt off, but because of what happened at my family's cabin in New Mexico. We used to go there every year, my parents, my older brother, and sometimes my aunt, uncle, and their kids too. It was this kind of double family vacation out in the woods for a week, and normally it was peaceful. We'd fish, roast hot dogs, play board games, and come home with stories about silly cousin drama or how many fish we caught. But that summer was different. Maybe it had something to do with the full moon, how it hung there, huge and yellow, for 3 nights straight. I don't know if that was important, but looking back, it sure feels like it was. At the time, I lived in Arizona, still do actually, and that year wasn't a great one for me. I'd had a falling out with my best friend, and I was feeling pretty low about my weight. I wasn't looking forward to this trip, wasn't looking forward to anything, really, but my parents insisted fresh air would be good for me, so I figured I might as well mope in the woods instead of at home. The cabin was in northern New Mexico, deep in a heavily wooded area near a small river. Cozy, nothing fancy, and no cell service except for this one spot near the edge of the front porch where, if you angled your phone just right, you could maybe send a text. We arrived in the afternoon. My aunt and uncle and their family weren't coming that year due to some scheduling conflict, which made the place feel a little too quiet. My brother and I helped Mom bring in groceries while Dad started setting up the grill. That first night we played board games, Scrabble, Cranium, even Uno. I actually had a good time, which surprised me. It was nice, being disconnected from the world. The next day, Dad took us fishing down by the river. My brother loved fishing, but I wasn't that into it, so I wandered around, taking pictures of trees and trying to clear my head. The day was beautiful, warm, with a cool breeze. When we got back, we roasted hot dogs outside. That's when I first noticed the moon. It was massive even before the sun had fully set. I joked with Dad about how bright it was going to get. Everyone trickled inside eventually, but I stayed out a little longer by the fire pit, enjoying the quiet. Dad came over before heading in and told me how much I meant to him. He kissed my forehead, even though I was a teenager, and I rolled my eyes, but it was sweet. It made me feel safe. After he went inside, I sat there, scrolling through my phone, trying to send a text to my friend back home. That's when it happened. The forest went silent. No insects, no owls, just nothing. Then, this strange whooshing sound swept over the treetops, like a massive gust of wind, but there was no breeze. The leaves rustled, not in a normal way, but in a wave, like something had passed above them. It gave me goosebumps. Then came the clicking. It was loud and sharp, echoing through the trees. It sounded unnatural, almost like echolocation. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding. Something heavy shifted above me. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I felt something there, something big. Then, a heavy thud, 20 yards away. A squeal followed, high-pitched and desperate. I looked up just in time to see a huge, bat-like shape lifting off from the ground, carrying something in its claws. The thing was alive, still struggling, and then gone. I ran inside, my pulse in my throat. My dad was in the kitchen, my brother sprawled out on the couch watching some old VHS movie. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because Dad's face changed instantly. I told them what I'd seen. My dad and brother grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. They were out there for a good 15 minutes, but when they came back, they hadn't seen anything. except they found blood on the grass. The next day, Dad, my brother, and my uncle who'd come for the day went hunting. The ladies, as they called us, stayed behind. My aunt taught me how to make Grandma's old French silk pie recipe. It was fun, a good distraction. When the guys came back, they'd bagged a decent-sized buck. Dad and my uncle took it behind the cabin to clean and quarter it. I overheard them talking about burying the remains in a deep hole about 25 yards from the cabin to keep scavengers away. That night, everything felt normal. We had a big dinner, watched some random TV shows, and after my aunt and uncle left, we went to bed. Around 2 a.m., my brother shook me awake. "You need to see this." I stumbled over to the window. Outside, near where they buried the deer remains, something was moving. The moonlight was bright enough to see. It had dug the hole back up, easily. It was hunched, leathery, with folded up wings, tearing at the remains with jerky, unnatural movements. My brother whispered, "Is that what you saw last night?" I nodded. We stood there, silent, watching. It must have heard something, stiffened, then took off in this awkward, powerful leap. We didn't wake Dad right away, but in the morning, we told him everything. My brother was all hyped, talking about staying up to see it again, maybe even shooting it. Dad wasn't thrilled, but he agreed. That night, we sat outside, Dad's rifle leaning against a chair. Midnight came and went. We were about to head in when I saw it, up in the tree. Red eyes, pig-like snout, small fangs glinting in the moonlight. Dad barely moved before it spread its wings and took off, vanishing into the black sky. The next morning, we told Mom. She half believed us, but my dad and brother and I, we knew. We still go to that cabin, but never again have we been there during a 3-night full moon. Not by choice, just how it worked out. And I wonder if that's important. If maybe whatever that thing was only comes out when the conditions are just right. I don't know what it was. A giant predatory bat? Some unknown creature that stays hidden except when it has to hunt? I have no idea, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. In the summer of 1997, when I was 16, I attended a Christian youth camp for girls. It was a 4-day, 3-night camp set deep in the forests of northern Montana. The place was called Silver Pine Retreat, a remote campground about 2 hours from town. Every summer, around 200 girls gathered there, sleeping in rustic cabins or tents, spending days canoeing, hiking, and learning scripture. It was a safe place, one where parents had no reason to worry. The final night of camp was always special. That was when we stayed up later than usual, huddled together, sharing scary stories. It was an unspoken tradition, a way to squeeze every last bit of excitement out of the week before we returned to our everyday lives. That year, our group was assigned to one of the older wooden cabins near the edge of the campground, surrounded by dense pines. There were about 12 of us in total, including my best friend, Emily. We had claimed the top bunks, blankets piled up around us, flashlights flickering in the dimness as we whispered and giggled. The stories that night were the usual kind, urban legends, local myths, the kind of thing you'd hear from a sibling trying to scare you before bedtime. I told a couple of stories, one with Emily's help. Eventually, as the night stretched on, my body grew heavy with exhaustion. I was barely listening as the last storyteller droned on, my head resting against the wooden wall behind me. I was so close to slipping into sleep when someone nudged me. "Tell one more," a voice whispered. I was too tired to argue, so I started talking, making it up as I went. Something about an old hunter who went missing in these very woods. I barely remember the words. I just remember how heavy my eyelids felt, the way my mind drifted like it was floating between sleep and wakefulness. I wasn't even fully conscious of what I was saying. Then suddenly I was awake. I was lying flat on my back, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. My body felt cold, and my lips were still moving. I was speaking, but I had no idea what I was saying. As soon as I became aware of it, my voice faltered, and I forced out a lame ending. And they all died. The end. Silence. I sat up, blinking, my vision adjusting to the dim light. Every single girl in the room was staring at me. A few of them had their hands pressed to their mouths, their eyes wide and wet with tears. 2 younger girls were silently sobbing, their shoulders shaking. Even Emily, who was rarely scared by anything, looked pale. "What?" I asked, but no one answered. Emily shook her head slightly, eyes darting to the crying girls. I felt a wave of unease settle over me. My skin prickled, my stomach twisted. The air in the cabin was thick, like the room itself had absorbed whatever had just happened. I didn't ask again. I was too tired, too unsettled. Instead, I curled up in my blanket, closed my eyes, and forced myself to sleep. A few hours later, I was being shaken awake. A camp leader loomed over me, her face stern. "Get up," she said. "Bring your things." Dazed, I obeyed. I gathered my blanket and flashlight, climbed down the ladder, and followed her outside. The night air was cold, pressing against my skin as I walked across the damp grass toward a tent pitched near the campfire pit. 2 other camp leaders stood nearby, their faces unreadable. "Put your things inside," one of them instructed. Inside the tent were 2 of the girls from our cabin, the ones who had cried the hardest. They were curled up in their sleeping bags, their faces red and puffy, their breaths still hitching. They wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak. They just lay there, silent tears rolling down their cheeks. I stepped outside again. The leaders stood waiting. "What did you say?" one of them asked. I swallowed. I don't know." They exchanged glances. "Emily said you fell asleep in the middle of your story." But the girls were terrified. They came to us saying they wanted to go home. Lily tried to explain, but she wouldn't tell us what you said. My stomach clenched. "I don't remember," I admitted. "I really don't." The leader sighed, clearly frustrated. "Since you scared them this badly, you're going to sleep out here with them tonight." I didn't argue. I didn't even try. I just crawled into the tent and lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling. The 2 girls sniffled beside me for a while before finally drifting into an uneasy sleep. I listened to the wind rustling through the trees, trying to shake off the heavy feeling in my chest. In the morning, they were gone. By the time I woke up, the tent was empty. I found Emily packing her things in the cabin. When I asked her what I had said, she shook her head. "You don't want to know. That was the last time I ever saw most of those girls. Camp ended and we all went our separate ways." Over the years, I tried asking Emily again, but she always refused to talk about it. A few years later, I ran into Lily at a grocery store. We caught up, talking about work and school. Just before she left, I brought up that night. She hesitated. Then, she said, "Sometimes I still have nightmares about it." That was all she would say. To this day, I don't know what I told them. I don't know what came out of my mouth in that dark cabin, what made those girls cry, what made even the camp leaders uneasy. But I do know one thing. I never told another scary story again. I don't know why I agreed to come out here. Maybe I needed to get away from everything, work, traffic, people. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle being alone for a few days. Whatever the reason, I packed up my truck with enough food, water, and supplies to last a week and headed out to an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. The place was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. I had found it online, a rental listing that promised solitude and a true wilderness experience. The pictures showed a sturdy wooden cabin, small but comfortable, surrounded by thick trees. It seemed perfect, a break from my usual life, a chance to clear my head. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads got narrower, turning from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. My truck bounced and jerked over the uneven path, dust billowing in the rearview mirror. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. I climbed out of the truck and stretched, taking in my surroundings. The cabin looked just like the pictures. Rough wooden logs stacked together, a slanted roof, a small front porch with a single rocking chair. A stone chimney jutted out from one side, and a narrow dirt path led around the back where a rusted-out water pump stood. Beyond that, nothing but dense forest stretching in every direction. The silence was unsettling. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no music. Just the sound of the wind stirring the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It should have been peaceful, but something about it put me on edge. Maybe I was just too used to noise. I grabbed my bags and went inside. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, the air stale from being closed up. The interior was simple. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch facing the fireplace. A narrow doorway led to a tiny bedroom with a creaky bed frame and a thin mattress. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. I sighed, dropped my bags, and started unpacking. By the time I finished, it was fully dark outside. I lit a couple of the old oil lamps that sat on the shelves and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth helped chase away some of the unease, and I told myself that I was just adjusting. A couple of days out here and I'd probably love the silence. That night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was uncomfortable, and the forest outside never seemed to fully quiet down. Every time I started to drift off, some new sound would snap me awake. A branch breaking, leaves rustling, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was just animals, but I still found myself lying there, staring at the ceiling, my body tense and alert. The next morning, I woke up late, feeling groggy and irritable. The sun was already high, spilling golden light through the dusty windows. I made coffee on the old stove and took a walk around the property, trying to shake the strange feeling from the night before. The woods were thick, the trees towering overhead, their branches tangled together. I walked for a while, following a faint deer trail until I came across something strange. A small clearing where the ground had been disturbed. The earth was turned up, like something had been dug up or buried. The shape was odd, too long and narrow for an animal burrow. I frowned, nudging at the dirt with my boot. Maybe an old fire pit, or just some natural shifting of the soil. I didn't like the feeling it gave me, though. Something about it was off. I turned and walked back to the cabin, telling myself it was nothing. The day passed slowly. I read, wrote in a notebook, and made a simple dinner. As night fell, the unease crept back in. The silence was too deep, the woods too still. I locked the door and shut the curtains, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no one out here. I was alone. But that night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a deliberate noise, something scraping against the outside wall of the cabin. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound came again, a slow, dragging scrape, like something being pulled along the wood. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A branch? A raccoon? But it sounded too deliberate, too steady. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. I sat up, listening, my breath shallow. Nothing, just the wind shifting through the trees. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe just my imagination. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The next morning, I went outside to check. My stomach twisted when I saw the marks on the cabin wall. Long, uneven scratches, running from just below the window down to the base of the wall that I stared at them, my pulse hammering. They weren't claw marks. They were too big, too deep. Something or someone had dragged something sharp against the wood. I packed my bags right then and there. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I didn't care if I looked stupid. I loaded up my truck, locked the cabin door behind me, and drove back down that narrow dirt road without looking back. I never told anyone what happened. Felt too ridiculous, too strange. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some old marks I hadn't noticed before. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that place again. I should have known something was wrong the moment I pulled up to the cabin. The trees were thick, almost suffocating, pressing in on all sides like they wanted to keep something hidden. The driveway was nothing more than dirt and gravel, barely wide enough for my truck, and the air had that heavy, damp smell of decaying leaves. It felt abandoned, forgotten, despite the fact that I was supposed to be staying here for the next week. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father's. I barely knew the guy, but when I mentioned needing a break from city life, he'd practically thrown the keys at me. Perfect place to clear your head, he'd said.
No neighbors, no noise.
Just you and the woods. At the time, it had sounded ideal. Now, as I stepped onto the warped wooden porch, I wasn't so sure. The door was unlocked. Not surprising, this deep in the woods, people probably didn't worry about break-ins. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and wood. The furniture was old, the kind you'd find in a house that hadn't been updated since the 70s. Brown plaid couch, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single hallway led to the bedrooms and the bathroom, and there was a small kitchen with an old white fridge that hummed too loudly. I dropped my bag near the couch and checked my phone. No service. That was expected. I had told myself I wanted to disconnect after all, but there was something about truly being cut off that made my skin itch. No phone meant no help if something went wrong. Not that anything would. I was just being paranoid. The first night was uneventful, mostly. The wind howled through the trees, making the old cabin creak. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. The city had a constant hum, a background noise of traffic, people, life. Out here, it was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal, the groaning of old wood. Every sound felt amplified, like the whole forest was leaning in, listening. The second day, I explored a bit. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for about an hour, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots. The air was crisp, and for a while, I felt that peace I had been looking for. Then I found the clearing. It was about a mile from the cabin, a wide open space where the trees suddenly stopped. In the middle stood a rusted-out pickup truck, the kind that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. The doors were gone, the hood open, the insides picked clean by time and animals. Grass had grown up through the tires. Something about it made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, trying to figure out why it unsettled me so much. Then I saw the tracks. They weren't fresh, but they weren't that old either. Footprints circling the truck. Not just one set, multiple. And not in a normal way, like someone had walked up, inspected the truck, and left. These tracks moved in strange patterns, overlapping, looping around each other. It looked like whoever had made them had been pacing, or waiting. I left quickly after that. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, I locked the door. The third day, I found the cabin's generator. It was old but still functional, and it powered the few lights inside. I spent most of the day reading, trying to push the image of those tracks out of my head. When the sun set, I turned on the porch light. That's when I saw it. The footprints. They were in the dirt just past the porch steps. Fresh. I didn't move at first. I just stood there, staring at them, my brain trying to make sense of it. I hadn't left the cabin all day. No one else was supposed to be out here. But there they were, leading from the woods, stopping right at the base of the steps. Someone had been here, watching. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lights on, listening for any sound outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the slow creak of the porch. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something heavier, something deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound didn't come again. But I knew someone was out there. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and got inside. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine was dead. I sat there, gripping the wheel, heart pounding. The truck had been fine yesterday. Had I left the lights on, drained the battery, or had someone done something to it? I got out, popped the hood. I wasn't a mechanic, but I could tell something was off. Wires had been cut, not chewed through by animals, cut deliberately. Panic set in then. My phone was useless. The nearest town was miles away. I had no way to call for help, and whoever had done this was still out there. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a rusty old hatchet I'd found in the cabin's shed, and locked myself inside. The next few hours were a blur. I kept pacing, checking the windows, listening for any movement. The forest was silent, too silent. Even the birds weren't making noise anymore. Then, just before sunset, I saw it. A figure, standing at the tree line. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but I could see the outline. Tall, still, just watching. I gripped the hatchet tighter. My mouth was dry. My body was screaming at me to run. But where? There was nowhere to go. Minutes passed. An hour. The figure didn't move. They just stood there watching. Then, as the sun dipped behind the trees, they turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept every light on, clutching the hatchet like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. The first light, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my bag, took as much food and water as I could carry, and set out on foot. I didn't care how far the nearest town was. I'd walk until I found help. The woods felt different that morning, heavier, like they were holding their breath. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but I never did. I walked for hours, muscles aching, paranoia making every sound feel like a threat. And then, finally, I saw the road. A single stretch of cracked asphalt, empty but real. I had never been so relieved. I followed it for what felt like miles until I heard the hum of an engine. A truck. An old man behind the wheel, eyes narrowing as he slowed beside me. "You all right?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, just a shaky breath. He didn't ask any more questions, just opened the door and let me in. We drove in silence for a while before I finally muttered, "There was someone out there." He nodded like he already knew, like he'd heard this before. "You're lucky," was all he said. I never went back, never told my dad's friend what had happened. I don't even know if I could explain it. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure in the woods, the footprints, the cut wires, and I know, without a doubt, that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I should have never come here alone. That thought kept circling in my head, over and over, like an alarm I had ignored for too long. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the stress of the city. No people, no distractions, just me, the trees, and the quiet. But now, Sitting in the dim cabin, with only the weak glow of my lantern barely reaching the corners of the room, I was beginning to understand why people don't go deep into the woods alone. The trip started normal enough. I had driven for hours, following winding roads that got narrower the further I went. The last stretch was nothing more than a dirt path, surrounded by trees so thick they swallowed the sunlight. By the time I reached the cabin, the air had a strange stillness to it. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I shook it off as my mind playing tricks on me. It was just the isolation, I told myself. It had been a long time since I had been this far from civilization. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. One bedroom, a kitchen, and a main living area with a wood-burning stove. There was no electricity, just a few gas lanterns and a fireplace. It had been years since anyone stayed here, judging by the dust. The windows were dirty, the furniture covered in old sheets, but it was peaceful, at least at first. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the first sign that something was wrong. A soft shuffling outside, like something moving through the leaves. I held my breath, straining to listen. A deer, I thought, or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, this time closer. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on dried leaves. Not an animal, something heavier. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the window. The glass was too fogged and dirty to see clearly. My brain raced through possibilities, maybe another hiker, maybe someone lost. But something about the way those steps moved made my skin crawl. Whoever it was, they weren't calling out for help. They weren't moving with uncertainty. They were creeping. I forced myself to get up, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought for chopping wood and stepped toward the door. The steps had stopped. I couldn't hear anything now, just silence. My own breath sounded too loud. I waited, staring at the door, expecting to hear a knock, a voice, something. But nothing came. After a long while, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe an animal had been walking around, and my mind had twisted it into something else. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and forced myself to go back to bed. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping just beneath the windows. Whoever had been out there had been watching me. The sight of them sent a chill through my body. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking my surroundings constantly. I told myself I would leave the next morning. It wasn't worth the risk. But as the sun set, a deep dread settled in my stomach. If they had been watching me last night, what would stop them from coming back? That night, I kept the hatchet by my bed. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. The wind howling through the trees, the creaking of the old wood. But nothing happened.
No footsteps.
No movement outside. Maybe they had left. Maybe I was safe. But then, as I was packing my things the next morning, I saw it. Something out in the trees. A figure, standing between the trunks, half hidden in the shadows. Just standing there, watching. I felt my breath hitch, my muscles freeze. They weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to see them. I grabbed my bag and bolted for my car. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just needed to get out. The car started, and I peeled out of there so fast the tires kicked up dirt and gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a real road, back where the trees weren't so thick, where I could finally breathe again. I never found out who it was. No reports of a missing person. No records of squatters or hikers in the area. Just silence. The only proof I had were the footprints around the cabin, the memory of that figure in the woods. I still think about it sometimes, about what might have happened if I had stayed just one more night, about what they wanted. I'll never go back to that cabin. And if you ever find yourself alone in the deep woods, remember, There are worse things than being lost. It started out as a quiet weekend getaway. I had been feeling worn out, and a few days in a cabin, away from the noise of the city, seemed like the perfect way to recharge. A friend of mine had a small cabin tucked deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive away. It wasn't exactly luxury. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, just the basics. A wood stove, a couple of bedrooms, and a porch overlooking a dense forest. But that's exactly what I needed. Peace, isolation, and some time alone to think. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, and the winding road leading up to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path. The woods were thick with trees, and the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. As I parked in front of the cabin, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is just waiting to break it. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaky porch steps, unlocking the door with the key my friend had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something faintly earthy, like pine needles. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living room with a couple of worn couches, and a fireplace on the far wall. The light was dim, but there was something warm about it. I liked the way it felt, isolated but comfortable. The place was as simple as I remembered. I threw my bags onto the couch, unpacked a bit, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the trees sway in the twilight. There was something about the woods here that felt different, more alive in a way. I had spent time in the wilderness before, but this place was different. Maybe it was the stillness or the feeling of being so far from anything. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. As the sky darkened, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled in. I had no intention of doing much, just relaxing, maybe reading, and enjoying the solitude. But as the hours passed and the wind picked up, I started to notice something. The cabin, despite its solitude, didn't feel empty. There was a sense of presence, like someone or something was just outside my line of sight. The kind of sensation you get when you feel eyes on you, even when no one is there. I tried to ignore it. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The crackling fire and the wind outside were enough to fill the silence. But then it happened. A noise, a soft tapping, almost like a finger drumming on wood. But it wasn't coming from inside. Came from the direction of the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't remember hearing anyone approach. I hadn't seen a single car on the road leading up to the cabin. I set my tea down, stood up, and cautiously walked over to the door. There was nothing, just the dark outline of the porch and the trees beyond. The wind was picking up now, howling through the branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of view. I double-checked the lock and returned to the fire. My hands were shaking, but I tried to push the unsettling feeling aside. I was alone. There was nothing out there, just the wind. I settled back onto the couch, trying to convince myself to relax. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence felt suffocating. Every crack of the wood, every shift in the breeze felt magnified. My mind kept drifting back to the tapping sound. Had I imagined it, or had someone really been there? The night stretched on, and I eventually went to bed. I kept the curtains closed tightly, and I slept fitfully, waking up several times, disoriented, with the sense that something was wrong. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin creak. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling exhausted. I hadn't slept well, and the strange noises from the night before were still fresh in my mind. I told myself it was just the wind, that the cabin was old, and it had its quirks, but something still felt off. I went out onto the porch to get some fresh air, hoping to clear my head. The sun was up now, casting long shadows over the forest. Everything looked so peaceful, too peaceful. The forest stretched out in every direction, a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. The silence was back, but this time it felt even more oppressive, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I decided to take a walk. Maybe the exercise would help shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I grabbed a jacket, put on my boots, and headed down a narrow trail that led into the woods. First, it was nice. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. I walked for about an hour, lost in the quiet beauty of the place. But then, as I was rounding a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange, something out of place. A set of footprints, fresh ones. They were larger than mine, deeper in the soft earth, and they led off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was certain I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail when I left the cabin. The prints looked recent, maybe from the last few hours. They didn't seem to belong to any animal I recognized. I followed them instinctively, even though my gut was screaming at me to turn back. The trail grew more overgrown as I moved deeper into the woods, and the prints became harder to follow, but I kept going. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Every step felt heavier than the last. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A broken-down shack, barely visible through the thick brush. It was made of old wood, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging under the weight of age. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know why, but the sight of it unsettled me more than anything else I had encountered. There was no reason for a shack to be so far out here, in the middle of nowhere. I stepped closer, carefully, trying not to make any noise. My mind raced with questions. Who built this place? Who would live out here so far from the cabin, in the heart of the woods? I reached the door of the shack and hesitated. Something told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open with a creak and stepped inside. The interior was dark, with the faint smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls were bare except for a few faded pictures and some old shelves. But what caught my eye were the marks on the floor, scattered, faint, almost like scratches. Took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. They were recent, too recent. Suddenly, the air felt thick, suffocating. My pulse raced, and I quickly turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was breathing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I bolted out of the shack, my breath ragged, and didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon. My mind was a blur, spinning with confusion and dread. Had I imagined the whole thing? The shack, the footprints, the whisper? It all felt like a dream or a nightmare. I locked the door and closed all the windows, not daring to go outside again. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself down. The shadows outside seemed to press against the cabin walls, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like the woods themselves were watching, waiting for something. As the night deepened, I heard it again, the tapping, faint but distinct. It was coming from the direction of the door. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood by the door, my breath shallow, waiting. The noise grew louder, more persistent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. And then I realized the footprints, the shack, the strange sounds, they weren't random. They were all connected. Something or someone had been out there and they were watching me. But I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like there was something protecting me. Something that had been with me all along. The presence that had been lingering in the cabin wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The tapping started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. I turned toward the sound, and for the first time I understood. The cabin wasn't empty, and it wasn't mine to keep. I'd always heard the cabin in the woods was a place for people who wanted to escape everything. A place to clear your mind, get away from the noise of the city, the rush, and the constant pressure. I didn't think much about that when I decided to go. After all, I was looking for some time alone to reset. The thought of being in complete silence, surrounded by nature, sounded like the perfect retreat. The cabin was far out. It wasn't on any map, at least not the ones I had. A long, unmarked road twisted up the mountainside, through thick trees, and around sharp bends that felt like they would send me off the edge of the world. I had rented the place online, and the listing said it would take a few hours to get there. I remember thinking that sounded like a bit much, but I wasn't going to turn back. I arrived just as the sky was dimming. The cabin was an old, weathered building, tucked away behind a large patch of trees. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine in a horror movie, but there was something oddly comforting about it. The walls were covered in dark, peeling wood that seemed to match the deep colors of the surrounding forest. There were no other houses around for miles, just towering trees, their limbs swaying in the wind. Inside, the place smelled of dust and pine. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and the furniture, while old, was surprisingly well kept. I immediately felt the weight of isolation. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, not even a landline. It was just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. That night, I sat up by the fire with a book I had been meaning to finish. The crackling flames filled the silence, and the air was crisp but not uncomfortable. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant sound of a twig snapping outside or a branch brushing against the side of the cabin. I thought nothing of it. It was just the forest, the wind, the animals, the sounds that came with being alone in the middle of nowhere. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. Every time I thought I heard a noise from outside, I'd go to the window to look, but there would be nothing. No movement, no signs of life. Just the still, dark woods stretching out into the unknown. The following morning, I woke up early, the air outside already cool and fresh. I stepped out onto the porch, stretching my legs and taking in the view. The woods seemed even quieter than the night before, a stillness that settled deep in my chest. I was still the only person around as far as I could tell. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no sign of anyone else anywhere nearby. But as I looked around the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I shrugged it off as nerves. I was just here to relax, after all. So, I took a walk down the narrow dirt path that led from the cabin. The sun was still low in the sky, and the forest was a deep shade of green, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the leaves above me. But there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was more like a soft shuffle, like someone or something was moving just beyond the trees. I stopped and listened, but the sound stopped too. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I had heard of them in these woods, but there was no denying the unease creeping into my mind. By the time the afternoon came, the unsettling feeling hadn't gone away. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger. When I went back to the cabin, I double-checked the locks on all the windows and doors, even though I didn't think anyone would be around for miles. But something felt wrong. There was no sign of life out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That evening, I heard the sound again. It started as a faint rustling, like branches moving in the wind, but it was different, too deliberate. Then, a low thud, like something heavy dropping. My heart started racing, and I immediately grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement. I stepped outside, trying to calm myself down, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. I walked around the cabin, scanning the area, but the forest was still and silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the floorboards, made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned outside, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. The next morning, I didn't feel any better. If anything, the dread had grown. I spent most of the day inside, avoiding the outside world, but as the sun began to set, I decided to go back out for a walk. I told myself I had to face whatever this was, to prove I wasn't scared. As I walked down the path again, something caught my eye, a small, weathered object half buried in the dirt by the side of the trail. I bent down to look closer. It was a broken piece of wood, but what made it strange was the carving. It looked like a symbol, a twisted, angular shape, like a crude representation of an eye. I froze. The feeling that had been gnawing at me for days now surged. I stood up quickly, glancing around. The forest was eerily quiet. There was no breeze, no animals, just silence. I walked faster, the uneasy feeling now overtaking my thoughts. My breath came quicker, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard the shuffling sound again, this time closer, much closer. I broke into a run. I don't know how long I ran, or what pushed me to move so fast, but by the time I reached the cabin, I was breathless and panicked. My heart pounded in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, rushing to the windows and pulling the curtains tight. I wasn't going out again. The rest of the night was a blur. I spent hours pacing, checking the locks, peering out the windows, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the cabin whole. The next morning, I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. The woods felt too oppressive, too suffocating. The odd symbol, the sounds, the constant feeling of being watched, they had gotten to me. I couldn't shake the terror that had set in. As I started to drive away, I glanced back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It sat there, still and empty, but for some reason, I couldn't help but feel like I had left something behind. Something that was waiting, watching, hidden in the shadows. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me, a cabin, and a few days of peace away from everything. I hadn't expected to feel anything other than relief when I saw the small, secluded cabin nestled against the edge of the woods. It wasn't much, rustic, with weathered wood and a little porch that had a few mismatched chairs. But it was all I needed. It wasn't far from a town, just a few miles down a dirt road. I had been looking forward to this time alone. Work had been overwhelming, and I needed space to breathe. I pulled up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching under the weight of the car as I parked near the porch. It was quiet, too quiet. No one was around. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I got out, grabbed my bags from the back seat, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. It wasn't locked. The interior was small, dimly lit by the light coming through the dusty windows. The wooden floors were creaky and uneven underfoot. A stone fireplace sat in the far corner, with a couple of old chairs scattered in front. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom. The place smelled old, like pine wood and something musty, almost like it hadn't been lived in for years. I dropped my bags onto the couch, walked around the place for a few minutes, and found everything in good condition despite the age. The windows weren't cracked, the furniture was solid, and the bedding on the bed seemed clean enough. I decided to take a walk to get a feel for the area. The woods around the cabin looked dense, the trees tall and thick. There were no trails, nothing marked to tell me where I should or shouldn't go. But I didn't mind. I walked around the cabin first, then decided to head down the small path that seemed to cut through the trees toward a small creek. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the earth damp beneath my boots. I followed the sound of running water, the creek louder now as I moved closer. The trees thinned a little, and there was an area where the water pooled into a small, clear pond. It looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. I sat down on a rock by the edge of the water, staring at the reflections of the trees above. The silence around me was deep, almost too deep, like the whole place was holding its breath. It was then that I noticed something strange. There was something off about the edge of the pond. The water was disturbed, just a little, but enough to make me feel uneasy. A small stone, maybe a stick, was moving in the water. It wasn't wind or current. The pond was too still for that. I watched for a moment, my heart beating a little faster, but the movement stopped as suddenly as it started. I stood up, shook my head, and told myself it was nothing, just an animal, a fish, or the wind. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned to leave, I heard something, like a crack of a twig, barely audible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I froze, my body instinctively tensing. The sound came from deeper in the woods, off to my right. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I quickly walked back to the cabin, my pace quickening, though I couldn't explain why. There was a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and went straight to the kitchen to make some coffee. My hands were trembling just a little, but I told myself it was the cold air. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it howling outside, pressing against the walls of the cabin. The sound of it rattling the windows made the quiet house feel even more isolated. I kept the fire in the fireplace going, trying to focus on the warmth it provided. The flames danced, casting long shadows across the room. I stayed up later than I expected, reading a book by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. There was nothing out there, just the wind, but my mind kept going back to the movement in the pond, the odd noise in the woods. Around midnight, I started to drift off. That's when I heard it again. Faint knock at the door. I sat up, my heart leaping in my chest. My eyes darted toward the front door. Another knock, this one louder. I stood up slowly, my legs heavy. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of me told me to ignore it. It was probably an animal, maybe something bumping into the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and slowly walked toward the door. There was nothing, no one standing outside, just the darkness. I stood there for a moment, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. My nerves were on edge, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and went back to the couch. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you're being hunted. It was the fear of being alone, deep in the woods with no one around for miles, and something watching, something out there. The next day, I decided to leave. The unease hadn't gone away. I packed my things quickly, moving from room to room, grabbing everything I had brought. When I went to the front door, I paused. I hadn't heard any noises during the night, but something about the place still felt wrong. The wind had died down, but the air felt thick, oppressive. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints, in the snow, leading from the woods right up to the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had walked right up to the door, then turned around and left. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. My mind raced, but no thoughts made sense. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, and for the first time, I realized that I hadn't been alone in the woods the whole time. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bags, got into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. The road felt longer on the way back, the silence heavier. Every turn, every shadow in the trees made my heart race. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the town, I didn't stop at the gas station. I didn't stop at the small diner. I kept driving all the way home, as far from that cabin as I could get. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Couldn't. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever was watching me, they were still out there, watching from the trees, waiting for the next person who was foolish enough to stay in that cabin. The woods had always felt strange to me, but today it was different. The wind had that biting chill, and the trees whispered in a way that made my skin crawl. I had come here to clear my head, to get away from the noise of everything back home. I didn't expect much more than a couple of hours of peace, but it had quickly turned into something else. The path I walked on was familiar, a small trail that wound its way through dense trees, but today the shadows seemed deeper, the air thicker. I knew I wasn't far from the small cabin where I'd spent weekends in the past, but something felt off. There was a silence that seemed unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and dry leaves. The farther I walked, the heavier the atmosphere became. The trees loomed like silent, watchful figures, their branches bare despite it being late autumn. A thick layer of fog had rolled in, making everything feel more enclosed, more suffocating. The chill in the air had deepened, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter, trying to stave off the creeping cold that made my breath visible in the air. I kept moving even though I felt like I should turn back. There was a nagging feeling, like something wasn't right. I had been on this trail dozens of times, but today felt different. My gut churned as I pressed on, my feet growing heavier with every step. After what seemed like an hour or so, I reached a clearing. The trees around the edge of the open space were spaced further apart, and the ground was softer here, a mixture of moss and old leaves. I stopped to catch my breath, glancing around. The fog had thickened so much that it was hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. That's when I heard it. A snap, the unmistakable sound of a twig breaking, came from somewhere to my left. My heart rate spiked, and I froze, straining my ears for any more sound. The air seemed to hold its breath along with me. Nothing, not a rustle, not a whisper. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, a deer, a rabbit, or even the wind playing tricks with the branches. But the longer I stood, the more uneasy I became. I started walking again, but this time I moved slower. My eyes darted between the trees, looking for movement, listening for the faintest sound. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fog thickened, so dense now that I could barely make out the shape of the trees around me. Each step felt like it was taking me further into an unknown place. My breath came faster, and the anxiety in my chest grew with every footstep. Another snap. I froze again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time I didn't wait. I didn't try to convince myself it was just the wind. I turned around and started running. The sound of my feet pounding the ground was the only thing I could hear now, louder than the wind or the trees. The fog was so thick I could barely see ahead of me, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of the woods. I needed to get back to the cabin, to where it was safe, to where I wasn't surrounded by shadows and that feeling of being watched. I ran and ran, not looking back, not daring to stop, but every time I tried to focus on my path, the trees seemed to move. The shadows felt like they were closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned, but I couldn't stop. The sound of my own footsteps was deafening now, and I heard nothing else.
No snaps, no rustling.
It was just me and the fog, and the overwhelming sense that something was chasing me. Suddenly, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, and I fell forward, my hands slamming into the ground. Pain shot up my arm, but I barely registered it as I scrambled to get up. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. I didn't even look at what I had tripped over. I just pushed myself to my feet and continued running, even faster now, every nerve in my body screaming for me to escape. But the woods seemed to have no end. I had no idea how much time had passed when I finally burst through the trees into the clearing near the cabin. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with adrenaline and fear. I was back, safe. At least I told myself I was. I didn't waste any time getting inside the cabin. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and sat down on the couch, my body still shaking. There was no way I was going back out there tonight. Couldn't. I tried to calm my breathing, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, like something was still out there, just beyond the fog. I spent the night awake, every creak and groan of the old cabin sending my heart into a frenzy. I checked the door, the windows, and even the locks, but no matter what, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. When morning finally came, the fog had lifted, and the world outside looked just like it always had. But I couldn't forget what I had felt. I couldn't forget the snapping branches, the heavy silence, the feeling of being hunted. I didn't return to those woods after that day. I was on the road for hours, just me and the hum of the engine. The last stretch was going to take me deeper into nowhere, or at least that's how it felt. My GPS lost signal about 30 minutes ago, which wasn't exactly reassuring, but I wasn't too worried. I'd been in tight spots before, mostly small towns with cracked roads and faded street signs, but I'd always made it out just fine. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, a weak orange glow stretching across the landscape. Nothing but empty fields, the occasional barn, and stretches of overgrown bushes on either side of the road. The trees started getting denser the further I drove, their branches hanging like dark fingers against the sky. The roads became narrower, winding more than I remembered from the maps I'd glanced at before leaving the last town. The smell of fresh earth and damp leaves crept through my slightly cracked window. I checked my phone. No signal. The thing is, I wasn't exactly lost, at least not yet. I had a destination, or I thought I did. There was a place called Jackson's Hollow, a small, forgotten town nestled in the middle of nowhere. I had never been there, but a job came up that needed me to go. Simple enough. I'd find the place, check out what they needed, and then head back to the city. That was the plan. The further I went, though, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't the usual kind of unease. There was something off about this whole place, like the world was a little too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind where you start to feel like you're being watched, even when you're completely alone. The trees pressed in closer. The road barely felt like a road anymore. It was more like a dirt path that hadn't been maintained in years. I slowed down. I didn't want to risk hitting something and getting stuck. The thought of walking out here for help in this wilderness wasn't something I relished. The sun was almost gone now, and the sky was deepening into a shadowy blue. I checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. No sign of Jackson's Hollow yet. I knew I had been driving for a while, but I thought I should have seen something by now, even a faint hint of lights or buildings in the distance. I rounded a sharp bend and saw it. A small, worn-down sign with the word Jackson's Hollow, painted in chipped, fading white letters. It was hanging by a single nail, swaying slightly in the wind. It was barely visible in the dim light, and I almost missed it. This was it, the town I had been searching for. But as I drove past, I felt a sense of relief, mixed with confusion. Where was everyone? The place looked deserted. The buildings, if you could even call them that, were crumbling, some with broken windows, others with collapsed roofs. The streetlights were either flickering or completely out. The road wasn't even paved here. It was just cracked concrete with patches of dirt. There were no cars, no people walking around. Nothing. I drove slowly through the town, my headlights bouncing off the dilapidated structures. I could make out the old church at the end of the road. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I felt the chill creeping into my bones, even with the windows up. This wasn't a normal town. There was something wrong with it, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. I parked in front of a small house. The place looked like it had been abandoned a long time ago, but I saw movement inside. It wasn't much, just a slight shift of the curtain. I decided to go up and knock. The house didn't look welcoming, but I figured I'd at least try to find someone who could tell me what was going on here. My hand hovered over the doorbell, but something made me pause. I didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the way the house was too still, or the fact that I had been driving for so long and hadn't seen anyone else. But I pressed the doorbell anyway, a harsh, buzzing sound breaking the silence. Nothing. I waited for a moment, staring at the door, but still no response. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I ignored them, turning and walking around the side of the house. There was a shed in the back, barely visible through the overgrown weeds. I didn't expect to find anything useful, but something made me walk toward it. As I reached the shed, I noticed something strange. A faint sound, like the scraping of metal against wood, echoed in the air. It didn't sound like an animal, more like someone or something moving inside. I approached the door cautiously, my hand brushing the peeling wood as I slowly pushed it open. The inside of the shed was dark, filled with dusty old tools and boxes. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my heart race. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but it was too still, too perfectly shaped. I stepped forward, squinting in the dim light, but before I could make out any details, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding. The door was now firmly closed, and the feeling of being trapped began to crawl over me. I tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Couldn't just freak out, not yet. I had to stay calm, think clearly. I turned back to the shed. The figure was still there, unmoving. My mind raced. Should I go back to the house? Should I try to find another way out? I didn't have many options. I took another step toward the figure in the corner. This time I wasn't afraid. Or maybe I was, but I wasn't going to let it show. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't a person at all. It was just an old mannequin, its clothes ragged, its face obscured by layers of dirt. It had been propped up against the wall, as if someone had placed it there a long time ago and forgot about it. I exhaled in relief, my heart rate slowing down. It was just a stupid mannequin. But as I turned to leave the shed, something caught my eye. On the ground near the door, partially hidden under a pile of old newspapers, was a small notebook. I bent down, pulling it out. It was leather-bound, old, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, skimming through the entries. They were all written in a hurried, messy hand, as if someone had been desperate to get their thoughts down. "Don't trust them," one entry read. "They'll make you believe you're safe, but you're never safe." I turned the page. "The things they hide are worse than you think. Don't go to the church." My throat went dry as I read the words. What the hell was this? Who wrote this? And why was it hidden here? Suddenly, I heard something again. The door. It was rattling now, like someone was on the other side, trying to get in. I stood frozen, the notebook still in my hands. It wasn't a person. This wasn't someone playing a prank. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Whatever was on the other side of that door was not human. With one final glance at the notebook, I tucked it into my jacket, bolted for the door, and shoved it open with all my strength. The moment I stepped outside, I saw it. Someone standing at the end of the yard, their silhouette barely visible in the fading light. I didn't think. I just ran. It started with a simple decision. A weekend away from everything. I needed to disconnect, get away from the noise of the city, and recharge. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect place. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the quiet. I found the cabin online. It was isolated, perched on the edge of a small forest, surrounded by towering trees. The pictures showed a rustic, wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a porch that overlooked a tiny lake. It looked peaceful, an idyllic retreat from the chaos of life. The cabin was advertised as being remote, which was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to be alone, to breathe without the constant hum of the city. When I arrived, I was greeted by the stillness of the woods. There was no one in sight. The cabin, though old, seemed sturdy enough. The wood creaked underfoot as I stepped inside. A musty smell hung in the air, the kind that comes with a place that hasn't been touched in a while. But it was cozy in a way that felt real. It didn't have the polished look of a rented vacation home. It had character. The place was exactly as the photos promised, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. The silence was thick, oppressive, almost. I told myself it was just the isolation. After all, who wouldn't feel a little nervous in an unfamiliar place? Far from anyone? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the first few hours unpacking, getting settled in. The cabin had a small kitchen with a gas stove, a living room with mismatched furniture, and a staircase that led to a loft bedroom. The walls were lined with old bookshelves, filled with a mix of dusty novels and strange trinkets. There was a large stone fireplace in the living room, and the sound of crackling would echo throughout the cabin whenever I fed it. The first night I was tired, so I went to bed early. The bed was small but comfortable, covered in an old quilt. I lay there, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling, the rustling of leaves outside. It was peaceful, but not the kind of peaceful I was used to. It was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I woke up in the middle of the night, a feeling of dread creeping over me. The silence was suffocating, as though the world had simply stopped. I couldn't hear anything. No wind, no animals, no night sounds. Just an unnatural quiet. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but something inside me told me to stay alert. The next morning, I went outside for a walk. The sun was shining, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest around the cabin was dense, with thick trunks and tangled undergrowth. It felt like I was the only person for miles. I wandered for a while, trying to shake the unease I felt, but it only seemed to grow stronger the further I walked. As I passed a large tree, something caught my eye, a small clearing in the woods. At the center of it, there was an old wooden structure, half hidden by vines and overgrown bushes. It looked like a shed, but it was in bad shape. The wood was rotting, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to investigate. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew colder. It wasn't just the temperature, it felt wrong. The inside of the shed was filled with old, decaying tools, rusty chains, and broken furniture. But what stood out the most was a large wooden chest in the corner. It was old, weathered, with strange markings carved into the surface. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't help myself. I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. But beneath the dust, something caught my attention. A small, tattered book. I picked it up, brushing the dirt off the cover. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed with age. There was no title, just a symbol. A strange, swirling shape that seemed to move when I looked at it. I opened the book, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was messy, as though written in a hurry. There were drawings, too, disturbing images of people and animals twisted in unnatural positions. Some of the pages were torn, but enough was still legible to make my stomach churn. It wasn't just a journal, it was something more, something darker. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to leave. I dropped the book back into the chest and hurried out of the shed, my pulse racing. As I walked back to the cabin, the weight of the book seemed to follow me. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I tried to shake the feeling of dread, but it lingered. When night fell, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence of the forest seemed to press in on me, suffocating. I went to bed early again, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, had me on edge. At some point during the night, I woke up with the distinct feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I lay still, listening. There was a faint sound outside, a soft scraping, like something dragging along the ground. I forced myself to get out of bed. My feet hit the cold wooden floor with a thud as I crept to the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. There was nothing there, but the sensation of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the book from the shed, determined to find out what it was all about. I read more of the journal, and the further I went, the more I realized that something wasn't right. The person who had written it described strange occurrences, people going missing, animals behaving strangely, and the gradual descent into madness. Then there was the ritual. I didn't believe in such things, but the book described in great detail how to perform a ritual to gain knowledge, to see what others cannot see. The instructions were simple, but the more I read, the more I felt an overwhelming urge to do it, to complete it. I closed the book, my hands trembling. I had to know what it meant. I went outside to the shed again, my nerves on edge. The air felt different now, thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I stood in front of the chest, staring at it for a moment. It seemed to call to me, beckoning me closer. I opened it once more, my heart pounding in my chest. The book was still there, waiting for me. I grabbed it, almost without thinking, and ran back to the cabin. The house felt different now, like it wasn't just a building anymore. It felt alive. I set the book down on the table and took out the things I needed. Candles, matches, and a knife I found in the kitchen. I followed the instructions as best as I could, marking the floor with strange symbols, lighting the candles in specific places, and reciting the words from the journal. As I did, the temperature in the cabin dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs. I could hear faint whispers, like voices in the distance. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, warping around me. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop. Something inside me wanted to know, wanted to see what the book promised. Then I felt it. Something cold, something dark, wrapped itself around my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, watching me. I don't know how long it lasted, but when it stopped, everything was silent again. The cabin was still. The candles had burned out. I was alone. I looked around, and for the first time, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was comforting. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by a strange peace. I never completed the ritual. I never needed to. I had seen enough. What I felt was real, more real than anything I had ever known. But it was over now. The book was gone, buried somewhere deep in the woods. The cabin was no longer a place of dread. I left the next morning, and as I drove away, I looked back at the cabin. It stood there, still and quiet, like it always had. But I knew better now. I had learned what I came for, and that was enough. I never liked driving at night, especially not through the middle of nowhere. But when my car broke down, it was too late to turn back, and there wasn't a single town for miles. The headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, the road stretching endlessly ahead, with trees lining both sides. Not a single light, not a single sign of life. It had been a long, tiring day. I'd been on the road for hours, hoping to make it to my cousin's house before the weather turned. The storm had been building all day, a slow, relentless thing, and now it was here. The sky was thick with clouds, dark and swollen, and the wind had started to pick up. The rain was coming down hard, beating against the car with a steady rhythm that almost drowned out everything else. My windshield wipers barely kept up, streaking the glass in frantic sweeps as I drove. I had just passed the last exit for miles when the car made a noise. A soft, almost inaudible click, and the engine sputtered. The lights flickered once, then went dark. I pressed on the gas, but nothing happened. The car rolled to a slow stop in the middle of the highway. The rain continued to pour down, and I sat there for a moment, completely still, trying to process what had just happened. Great, I thought. Just great. I tried the ignition again, but nothing. I checked the gas gauge, plenty of fuel. The engine wasn't turning over. I cursed under my breath. I didn't have a phone charger with me, and I wasn't even sure which direction the nearest town was. I'd been driving through this remote area for so long that I had no idea how far I was from anything resembling civilization. The rain was getting heavier now, the sound pounding against the roof like the sky itself was angry at me. I turned on the hazard lights, hoping someone would come by, though I knew it was unlikely. This stretch of road was almost deserted. I wasn't even sure if there were any gas stations or rest stops nearby. There wasn't even a shoulder to pull off onto, just a narrow, two-lane highway cutting through a dense forest on both sides. I glanced around, seeing nothing but trees, dark and unmoving. The road felt like it was swallowing me whole, the isolation pressing in. I had no choice but to get out of the car. I grabbed my jacket, a thick fleece one that I always kept in the back seat for just such emergencies, and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me immediately, and the rain soaked through my jacket in no time. The wind bit at my face, and I squinted into the storm, trying to see if I could make out anything in the distance. There was nothing, just blackness and rain. I popped the hood and stepped around to the front of the car, hoping to see something obvious that might explain the breakdown. There was nothing that seemed out of place, though. The engine looked fine, no smoke, no strange smells. I fiddled with a few things, trying to remember what I'd read about car troubles in the past. Nothing worked. I didn't want to stand out here in the rain for too long, so I got back in the car, slamming the door behind me to shut out the storm. The cold was seeping into my bones, and I felt a creeping sense of panic building in my chest. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find help, but there was no cell service, no signs of life. Just trees, darkness, and the never-ending rain. The sound of the rain hitting the roof grew louder, almost deafening, but I didn't dare get out again. My mind kept running in circles, thinking about the worst-case scenarios, wild animals, bandits, something worse. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about this place, something more than just the isolation and storm. I stared at the empty road ahead, waiting for anything to happen. Minutes dragged by, and the storm didn't let up. The car seemed to groan under the weight of the rain. It was all so silent, except for the sound of the rain and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. Then, as if out of nowhere, I thought I heard something, a rustling in the trees off to the side of the road. I froze, listening. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but the sound came again, louder this time. I stared into the blackness, trying to make sense of it. It didn't sound like an animal. No, this was different. Something was moving out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. My heart started to race, and I quickly locked the car doors, even though I knew there was no one to be seen. I reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out the flashlight I always kept in there. The beam of light flickered as I switched it on, and I pointed it toward the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. There was nothing, just rain-soaked branches swaying in the wind, a few leaves fluttering down, but nothing more. I shook my head, trying to calm my nerves. It was just the storm playing tricks on me, I thought. Maybe I was imagining things. But as the seconds passed, that creeping unease didn't fade. It only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. But I was too afraid to open the door again and check. The minutes passed slowly, like hours, as I sat in that car. The feeling of being watched never left, and my nerves were fraying at the edges. Then, just when I thought I might be losing my mind, something changed. The wind died down for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, everything was silent. I heard it, a soft, slow crunch of footsteps on the wet ground. I froze. My eyes darted to the trees, searching the darkness for any movement. The footsteps were too soft to be an animal. They were deliberate, heavy, as though someone or something was walking slowly toward my car. My breath caught in my throat, and my hand instinctively moved to the door handle, though I had no intention of getting out. The footsteps grew louder, closer. There was something about them that felt wrong. They didn't sound like a person. There was no rhythm to the steps, no normal pace. It was like whoever or whatever was walking was unsure of itself, hesitant, almost dragging itself along. I could feel my pulse in my ears now, the fear making it impossible to think straight. My eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just dark shadows in the rain. But I could still hear the footsteps, the strange, dragging footsteps that were getting closer and closer. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing right behind me, but there was nothing. The road stretched out empty in both directions. But then, I saw something flicker in the trees to my left, a shadow, quick and unnatural, darting between the trunks. My stomach churned. Suddenly, I heard a thud on the roof of the car. I jerked back in my seat, my heart leaping into my throat. What the hell was that? The rain kept pouring, but the sound of footsteps on the ground had stopped. Now, all I could hear was the strange scraping noise coming from above. It was faint, like something heavy was slowly dragging across the roof, but I couldn't see anything through the windshield. I sat there, frozen, barely breathing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The minutes stretched on. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door and check? Should I drive away, even though I had no idea if the car would start? Should I just wait here and hope for the best? Another thud, louder this time, followed by a long scraping sound again, as if something heavy was being dragged along the roof. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what it was. My hand reached for the door handle, and I pulled it open, stepping out into the rain again. I shone the flashlight upward, pointing it at the car's roof, but there was nothing there, just the slick, dark surface of the car, glistening under the beam. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure low to the ground, crouching in the trees at the edge of the road. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that were too long, too twisted. It was covered in mud, its skin pale and sickly. Its face was hidden by the shadow of the trees, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and predatory. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the door shut and scrambled back into the car, my heart racing. The engine still wouldn't start. The strange figure in the trees was still there, watching, waiting, but now I was too scared to care. I kept trying the ignition over and over, but nothing happened. Panic set in, and then, finally, it started. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding off down the road. I didn't look back, didn't care about anything else. All I wanted was to get away. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw a light in the distance, a small gas station by the side of the road. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I got out of the car. I didn't care if the place was closed. I just needed to be somewhere safe. The station was abandoned. No one was there. I stayed inside, locked the doors, and didn't leave until morning. The sun rose, and the storm finally passed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching. And I didn't stop looking over my shoulder the entire way home. I never should have gone on that hike alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my boots, and the mountains. I had been planning it for weeks, thinking that some solitude in the wild would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known, the kind of place where you could feel like you were the only person on Earth, the perfect way to recharge. The morning I left, the weather was clear, a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The trailhead was just off the main road, and as I parked my car, I was met with the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with starting something new. I checked my pack one more time, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map. I knew the trail, at least the general layout of it, so I didn't expect to get lost. Still, I always like to be prepared. I locked the car and set off, breathing in the fresh, crisp air. The trail started out easy, winding through thick trees, their leaves already starting to turn amber for the fall. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail dipped down into a small valley, following a creek that twisted through the trees. It was quiet, with just the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call overhead. I stopped a few times to take pictures, admiring the landscape, but each time I looked around, something seemed off. The woods felt dense, too dense. The trees crowded in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination, I thought. About halfway through the hike, the trail became steeper, leading up toward a rocky ridge. I had read that the view from the top was breathtaking, and that's what kept me going. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I welcomed the physical challenge. I was in good shape, and this was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been walking for hours, and the trail was starting to feel unfamiliar. The path was narrowing, becoming more overgrown. The usual trail markers were sparse, and I started to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. I checked my map, but it didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. The contours of the land were wrong. I couldn't figure it out. I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of nature dimming as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, hoping the trail would open up again. But it didn't. It just got worse. The path became more and more difficult to follow, the ground uneven and slippery from the morning dew. I found myself scrambling over rocks and fallen branches, my heart rate picking up as the trail seemed to disappear entirely. At this point, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. It was as if the forest had closed in around me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. I should have turned back then. The thought crossed my mind. but something kept me going. Maybe it was the idea of the view at the top, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I had gotten myself into a situation I couldn't handle. I kept moving, pushing through the underbrush and ignoring the creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. There was something else, something wrong. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a cliff, the rocks jutting out sharply toward the sky. It was a view, but not the one I had been expecting. The mountain peak was still out of reach, and the dense forest stretched endlessly behind me. The silence was oppressive, and it was as though the entire world had stopped. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where I was, but everything seemed unfamiliar. That's when I realized I had made a mistake. I'd taken the wrong path. Somehow, I had wandered off the main trail into an area that was rarely visited. I had no idea how far I had gone or where I was in relation to the trailhead. My phone had no signal, of course. I felt a wave of panic rush over me. This wasn't just a missed turn or a minor detour. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a cold, golden light. The woods felt different in the fading light, darker, more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there before it got completely dark, but the thought of retracing my steps felt impossible. The trail was barely visible now, and with every step I took, the dense forest seemed to swallow me whole. I started moving again, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any recognizable landmarks. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I tried to remember my surroundings, any distinctive features of the landscape that might help me find my way back, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. Nothing stood out. I began to feel the weight of panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't keep moving like this. I needed to stop and think. I found a small clearing and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted, become something I didn't recognize. As the light faded, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the chill of the night air sank into my bones. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay put and hope someone would come looking for me, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I opted for the latter. It felt like my only option. I picked a direction and forced myself to walk. The darkness pressed in on me like a weight, and I stumbled over roots and rocks in the growing gloom. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural presence. It was just the primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. Couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A light. It was faint at first, just a small glow in the distance, but it was enough to give me hope. I hurried toward it, my legs burning, my breath shallow and fast. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or someone else's flashlight. It was the last remnants of daylight, barely visible through a break in the trees. And just beyond that break, I saw the trail. A small sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the turnoff to the main trail. I followed it without hesitation, my legs shaky but driven by the overwhelming need to get out of the woods. I kept my focus on the trail, ignoring the growing darkness around me, until finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the main path. Relief flooded through me, so intense that it almost brought me to my knees. I looked around, the familiar trees and rocks no longer feeling ominous but like old friends. I knew exactly where I was now. The end of the trail was just a few miles away. By the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, and the night air was crisp and cool. My car was waiting for me, a beacon of safety. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just got in, started the engine, and drove off without another thought. I don't know what exactly happened out there, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can become lost in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. That forest isn't some tranquil escape. It's a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head: I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. I had always been someone who needed to escape into the wild, to get away from the noise of the world. The idea of hiking alone in the mountains always felt like the perfect way to clear my mind. I'd done it countless times before, but this time something felt different. It wasn't just the usual thrill of adventure, the expectation of solitude or the beauty of nature. It was something else, something nagging at the back of my mind. I woke up early, packed my bag with the essentials: water, snacks, first aid kit, a map of the trail, and of course, a flashlight. I made sure my boots were tightly laced up and double-checked the straps of my backpack to ensure everything was secure. My plan was simple: take the trail up, enjoy the peace, and head back down by nightfall. The air was cool, fresh with a crispness that signaled the start of autumn. I parked my car at the trailhead just as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. The trail stretched before me, wide and inviting, winding up into the thick forest. I could hear the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of birds in the distance. I was used to the sounds of the woods, but something about today felt off. The air seemed heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. The first few miles were easy, a steady climb through the woods, the path well-marked and clear. My pace was slow but steady, my feet crunching against the loose gravel beneath the dirt trail. The sun crept higher, dappling the path with patches of warm light, and I breathed in deeply, savoring the tranquility. It was exactly what I needed. As I moved further up, I noticed fewer and fewer signs of other hikers. It was a popular trail, but by now I hadn't passed a single person. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they had taken a different path, or perhaps they had started their hikes earlier. Still, there was a strange emptiness to the forest now, a quiet that went beyond the usual stillness of nature. The path began to narrow as I moved deeper into the mountains. The trees around me thickened, their branches intertwining above, blocking out most of the sun. Shadows deepened, and the air grew cooler. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to dismiss it. I was alone in the woods, that was the point, right? To be alone with my thoughts, away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. I pushed on, my footsteps growing louder in the silence. I glanced down at my watch. It had been about 2 hours since I started. I was beginning to feel the weight of my pack, but I didn't want to turn back yet. The view from the top was said to be spectacular, and I was determined to see it for myself. I pressed forward. Around a bend, the trail suddenly grew steeper. I could see the first hints of the rocky outcrop that marked the last stretch of the hike. The trees thinned, and the ground beneath my feet became uneven. It was a difficult climb, but nothing I couldn't handle. I took it slow, placing each foot carefully as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the more unsettled I felt. There was a strange quiet in the air, an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the lack of other hikers, it was something more. The sound of the wind, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves. It all seemed muffled, like I was in a vacuum. I paused for a moment to catch my breath, taking in the view. The valley below stretched out, a patchwork of greens and browns, the distant peaks just barely visible through the haze. It was beautiful, but something about the scene didn't feel right. I felt like I was being watched, but when I glanced around, there was nothing but trees and rocks. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. It was just my imagination running wild. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, and I'd never had this feeling. But as I continued to climb, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Then I saw it. Just off the trail, barely visible through the trees, was something that didn't belong. A campfire. It was small, the smoke rising lazily into the air, but it was the wrong place for a campfire. There was no campsite nearby, no clearing, no sign of anyone. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Was someone else hiking this trail? Or had someone set up camp here without permission? Curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously made my way off the trail, moving toward the fire. The crackling sound of the flames seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, and with each step I took, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few moments, but there was no one there, just the trees. The fire was small, contained within a ring of rocks. The ground around it was untouched, not a single footprint marking the earth. I squatted down, my hand brushing the edge of the fire pit. The stones were cold, and the fire was nothing more than a few embers, barely smoldering. It hadn't been used for hours, maybe even longer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I looked around again, the unease I'd been feeling earlier now turning into full-blown anxiety. I stood up quickly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn back, I noticed something strange on the ground. A small, weathered backpack, half hidden behind a boulder. It was an old one, the fabric faded and frayed, with a few items scattered around it. My stomach twisted as I looked at the backpack. Something about it felt wrong. It was too out of place. I walked closer, my footsteps hesitant, my mind racing. I crouched down, carefully lifting the backpack. It was heavy, filled with something. I opened it, my fingers trembling. Inside were a few things that made my heart stop. A flashlight, a map that had been torn and crumpled, and a small notebook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. I quickly put the backpack down, my mind racing. Someone had been here recently. Someone had left in a hurry, or maybe they'd never intended to come back. But where were they now? Why had they left all this behind? Suddenly, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and I heard a distant sound, like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was eerily quiet, and the noise seemed out of place. I stood there for a few moments, straining to hear more, but all I could hear was the wind. I looked around, my instincts screaming at me to leave. I turned on my heel and rushed back to the trail, my pace quickening as I tried to push away the mounting dread. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I climbed higher, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with each step. The last stretch to the summit was grueling, but I finally made it. The view was stunning, just as promised. I could see the whole valley laid out before me, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in rays that bathed the mountains in a golden glow. But I didn't feel awe or peace. I felt nothing but relief. Relief that I had made it, and that I had put some distance between myself and whatever was lurking down the mountain. I sat on a rock at the top, taking in the view, but my mind kept returning to the campfire and the abandoned backpack. I knew I couldn't ignore what had happened. There was something wrong, something I couldn't explain. But for now, the only thing I could do was stay on the summit, breathe deeply, and wait until I had enough courage to head back down. As the sun began to set, I gathered my things, ready to make my way back. The way down was less challenging than the climb up, but it was still nerve-wracking. The same feeling of being watched crept up on me again, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there. Just the trees, just the silence. When I finally reached the trailhead again, I felt a deep sense of relief. The car was just where I had left it, parked in the same spot. I tossed my backpack in the trunk, got in, and slammed the door shut. The moment I started the engine, the weight in my chest lifted. I drove home, my mind still reeling. I couldn't explain what had happened up there, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been in the forest that day wasn't something I wanted to meet again. I wasn't expecting anything crazy when I planned the weekend trip. It was supposed to be simple. 2 nights in the mountains, just me and nature. It was late September, and the air was already turning crisp. The forecast promised clear skies, perfect camping weather. I wanted a break from my routine, something to clear my head for a while. I packed light, just the basics. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a flashlight, extra batteries, enough food for 2 days, and plenty of water. I threw in a knife, a small first aid kit, and my phone, fully charged. I wasn't going too deep into the wilderness, maybe 5 miles from the main trailhead, but it was far enough to feel isolated. That's what I wanted: quiet, peace, and time to think. The drive up was uneventful. The sun was shining through the trees as I wound my way up the gravel road toward the trailhead. I parked my car, double-checked my gear, and set off on the trail around noon. The forest was beautiful, dense with towering pines and thick underbrush. I could hear birds chirping and the wind whistling softly through the branches. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. About an hour into the hike, I veered off the main trail onto a smaller, less used path. I'd read about a good camping spot near a small stream, and I was determined to find it. The trail was narrow, almost overgrown in places, but the air smelled fresh, and the leaves crunched under my boots. I felt completely alone. No distant voices, no hum of cars, just the forest. By mid-afternoon, I found the spot. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with the stream just a few steps away. The water was clear and cold, the kind you could drink straight from if you had to. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the water but far enough that it wouldn't keep me awake. Once my camp was ready, I sat down on a log, pulled out a granola bar, and just listened. The forest had this hum to it, a mix of wind, water, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to remember the last time I felt that calm, but nothing came to mind. I spent the afternoon gathering some firewood, nothing too serious, just enough to cook dinner and stay warm for a while. As the sun dipped lower, I lit a small fire and boiled some water for my dehydrated meal. Beef stew, not exactly gourmet, but after a day of hiking, it tasted amazing. By the time I finished eating, the light was fading fast. I leaned back against the log and watched the sky turn from orange to deep blue, then black. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like glitter. I could barely see my hand in front of my face without the firelight. That's how dark it got out there. I threw a few more logs on the fire and stayed up for a while, enjoying the warmth and the sound of the crackling wood. Eventually, though, the long day caught up with me. I doused the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest outside was quiet except for the sound of the stream. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember is waking up to something outside. First, I thought it was the wind. I lay there listening, half asleep, but the sound didn't stop. It was a steady crunch, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Not fast, not hurried, just walking. I held my breath, straining to hear. My heart started to race, pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight was next to me, and I grabbed it with a shaky hand. I waited for a moment, listening. The footsteps stopped. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the tent wall. Nothing, just the thin fabric glowing in the light. I took a deep breath and told myself to relax. Maybe it really was just an animal passing through. But then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. Yelling seemed like a bad idea. If it was an animal, it might scare it off, but if it wasn't, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight lit up the clearing, casting long shadows across the ground. I swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The trees looked taller and darker in the dim light, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. They weren't moving, just standing there, barely visible in the shadows. My pulse skyrocketed. I couldn't make out their face, just the outline of a person, tall and still. "Hello!" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. I felt my stomach tighten. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay quiet, to stay hidden, but I couldn't just sit there. I had to know who or what was out there. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other. The air was cold against my skin, and I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. I walked slowly toward the figure, keeping the light trained on them. "Who are you?" I said, louder this time. They turned and walked away. No hurry, no panic, just turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what just happened. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I wanted to chase after them, but something told me not to. Something about the way they moved, the way they didn't even glance back, it wasn't right. I backed away slowly, keeping the light on the trees. I didn't turn my back until I was inside the tent with the zipper closed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell was that? Why were they just standing there? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. It all felt like footsteps. I kept the knife in my hand, ready for whatever came next. But nothing happened. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just stuffed everything into my bag and started back down the trail. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every step, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure again. But the trail was empty. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away from the trailhead, back on the main road. I haven't been camping since. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I think about it. I can still see the outline of that figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to wander off the trail.